Yikes, sorry. Evening, guys. Hopefully your day is going well. Keep posting questions if you guys do have any additional questions that are popping up for you guys. It's been a good day around here. My daughter is trying out for softball right now. My boy plays 3-on-3 in a little while. It looks like the questions that we've got coming in shouldn't prevent me from being able to help out with his team. My team, Teddy Roosevelt, is also doing great this evening, and so I'm looking forward to another fantasy football victory. Hopefully, if you are a fantasy football player, your team's doing well. And then obviously the Vikings are doing well right now too, so hopefully that cheers you up as well. So let's take a look at your review session questions you guys have for tonight. It looks like they're all revolving around the same sorts of topics, and so let me help you out with those tonight first. Let me also close the blinds. Sorry about trying to blind you guys with the brightness from outside. But we'll start off with questions from period 2, and then I'll run through periods through 2, 4, 5, 6 as I'm able to work my way, and then I'll be able to come back to them. Any questions that pop up, I'll be able to help out with those. So first of all, first question is, what is the importance of Abigail Adams in Chapter 8? The book mentioned her in the back of the chapter as an important person, but didn't talk much about her. So when we think about Abigail Adams, she's the wife of John Adams. She's going to be super important over the next few chapters as the first lady for John Adams. She's also going to be famous because she's pretty outspoken when it comes to revolutionary ideas. And the revolutionary idea that she's going to be getting into is the idea that women should perhaps be rolled into the revolution as well. Not super important for this chapter, but it'll be popping up in upcoming chapters as being an important thing. Another question was, in addition to that, was asking about Burgoyne's blundering invasion. So when you think about Burgoyne and Howe, they're mentioning for you two generals for the British. There's General Howe, who's in New York. Burgoyne is up in Canada, and the idea is that Howe will hold on to New York, and Burgoyne will move down the Hudson River, connecting with Howe. And the hope is that they can then cut off all of the New England states and also New York, so that all the troublemaker colonies are all under the control of the British in one space. Obviously, with Burgoyne, when he starts moving through the backcountry in New York, he's going to be ambushed by Nathaniel Greene and Benedict Arnold, and the two of them are going to be able to attack and defeat the British as they're moving south. And that's going to be the turning point battle of the American Revolution, where once that victory is won, the French will jump in on the side of the colonists so that they're able to then win the war. Let me take a second here. Hold on just a second. I just want to make sure that the sound was working for you guys, so it sounds like the sound is doing just fine. So we'll be able to continue with our questions. The next question says, could you state the most important turning points in the Revolutionary War? Also, do we need to know anything about the French Revolution? So first of all, turning points for the American Revolution. Beginning, Lexington, Concord, and then the Battle of Bunker Hill is going to be the earliest moments in the Revolution where the Americans are demonstrating that they're not going to fold up quickly and they'll continue fighting. Learning about the battles of like New York, Boston are more important from the big standpoint of knowing that the British were trying to conquer all the eastern seaboard cities, and even when they did that, the colonists weren't folding up and quitting. Saratoga is obviously the most important battle of the Revolution from the standpoint that it's a turning point of the war, and it brings the French in. And then after 1780, remember the war is going to go from the north to the south. And in particular, you want to notice how Cornwallis being beaten up by Southern soldiers and malaria and all sorts of supply issues. He's going to go to Yorktown, and then with Yorktown, that's the big battle at the end that is the summation of the war, where Britain is going to lose. Do you need to know anything about the French Revolution? Some, but not tons in detail. The key thing to think about with the French Revolution is we're going to study it more in chapters 9 and 10. When the French Revolution is taking place, they're going to be inspired by the American Revolution, and America is going to be put into the situation of deciding if they wanted to join with the French to support the revolution or not, and it's going to become a point of controversy, especially with George Washington. But that revolution is coming right at the tail end of the American Revolution, and so understand that the two are happening pretty close to one another is a good thing. What will we need to know about the different acts? You need to know the importance of them, and so the ones we learned about, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Currency Act, Tea Act, Townshend Duties, All of them are important, and so I would love to let you off the hook of not having to know those things. But that's specifically why we had to do the study chart, so you can be working on retaining that information so you're able to be safe on the test. Let me see here. What acts in Chapter 7 wanted and did not want salutary neglect? I think that the best way to answer that is for the British. The British were trying to figure out ways to gain revenue from the colonists and to put them under control. And the colonists were constantly feeling threatened for the salutary neglect that they had enjoyed during the time period of the colonial times. And so each time an act was passed, even if the king was trying to make it something that was mild, the colonists started sensing more and more that their independence was being threatened. And that's what made the colonists so angry as they moved from 1763 to 1775. Looks like, Mariah, the question as far as are there any specific battles within the Revolution? I've kind of laid out for you the big picture of them. Will we need to know the dates and areas where they occurred? I'm not going to have any questions that say in 1777 this happened, but I will probably have questions that give you details that are going to be asking you to understand specific battles, especially the major ones like Lexington, Concord, Saratoga, and Yorktown, most notably of them. Next question is asking about mercantilism. Mercantilism is a concept where imagine that you are the leader of a country and you start a colony somewhere across the ocean. The idea of mercantilism is that the colony that you've created is only in existence to supply you with raw materials that will help your mother country to get more wealthy. The idea is that you're going to keep them from being able to create factories so they can't manufacture their own stuff. So these colonists will be sending you raw materials that you can buy cheap. You'll then be able to turn that stuff into finished goods, and so you'll be able to get cheap raw materials, and then you can also sell them finished goods. And so the people living there are going to be constantly find themselves in debt issues, but they'll be helping the in this case, British Empire become very wealthy and powerful so that they can then expand their empire more fully. Let me see here. What is the Declaration of the Rights of Man? That is what was created in France as a counterpart to the Declaration of Independence, where the French Revolution articulated what their beliefs were as far as what people's rights should be, and it was a product of the Enlightenment, like the Declaration of Independence, that was trying to lay out these are the visions for what a government should be in France. The sad thing in France, though, is it's going to turn into a reign of terror, a bloodbath, massive executions. Guillotines are going to be used to cut off people's heads, and so it's going to become much more violent as far as one group persecuting another than what you saw inside the United States with Loyalists versus Tories. So let's take a look next at Period 4's questions. First question is asking about the Declaratory Act. Declaratory Act is simply after the Stamp Act gets repealed, the king is going to take away a tax when the colonists protest a bunch. The Declaratory Act is announcing, though, that from now on, the colonists, if they are going to be having taxes placed on them, the Declaratory Act says the colonists must obey every decision by Parliament and the king to the letter or else. And there isn't really a consequence attached to it, but it's an announcement that the colonists are supposed to be obedient to the king and Parliament. And for the colonists, they see this initially as just an empty threat, that there isn't anything behind it, until the next round of taxes come with the Townshend duties that's going to show to them that the king is serious about taxing them and enforcing those taxes with navigation acts. And so the Declaratory Act is a signal that salutary neglect is going to be weakened in the future, especially if the colonists protest. The next question, what was the African-American role in the Revolutionary War? You start off with a baseline that you'll have African Americans from the north to the south find themselves in slavery in different situations. But then we find in the north there are a number of African Americans who do serve on the side of the revolution. There is also the appeal that's put out by the Virginia governor and the British Empire, arguing that if a African American fights for the side of the British, they will then be freed at the end of the war. And we do have thousands of former African slaves who will get onto boats going along with the British soldiers to different British colonies after earning their freedom during the Revolution. Can I explain how Burgoyne's invasion happened and and the effect it had on the Revolution? So same thing we talked about earlier. Howe is going to be in New York. Burgoyne is going to be encouraged to move from Canada south to try to cut the north in half. And what they mentioned to you is Howe was comfortable in New York. He started sending troops to Philadelphia because that's where Washington was. And so when Burgoyne was trapped in the back country of New York, there was no aid coming to him. And when the Native American allies left, out of fear of what the Americans were going to do, Burgoyne found himself stuck. And so he got surrounded, captured, was removed from the war, and that convinced the French that perhaps they should join on the side of the Americans. That hopefully answers the next question that I see here. Can I explain more on William Howe's role? Obviously, he is a major general for the British who is going to occupy New York, but he is going to find himself in over his head as far as trying to figure out how to root out the different American armies that are going to be operating in the backcountry. Next question is asking about the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. And what's happening in the western frontier is you've got Americans and their Native American allies fighting against the British and their Native American allies. And the Treaty of Fort Stanwix is going to be a treaty signed with pro-British Iroquois troops. And the treaty is going to force them to give up their homeland and move further out west because they've been seen as a threat and they've now been conquered. And so this is another example of Native Americans who are being forced to move further out westward for colonial expansion. And we see this during the Revolution. Next question is, what is the Quebec Act? That was the law that was created by the king that would define what the relationship between Quebec and the British was going to be. It gave the British some definition as far as what their independence looked like, and they were not going to be allowed to have assemblies or a jury system for their court trials, but they were given land south to the Ohio River, which was west of the Proclamation Line of 1763, which made a lot of colonists feel betrayed. And then also the fact that there was no assembly or a jury system set up made colonists wonder if that's what was going to be imposed on them later on by the British. What was the main difference? Next question, what was the main difference between the Tea Act and the Sugar Act? Sugar Act came first in 1764, then the Stamp Act in 1765. The Tea Act is going to come out of the Townshend Duty. So the Townshend Duty is going to create all sorts of taxes on all sorts of different items. But after a series of protests, the king is going to wipe out all of the taxes except for the one on tea. And then it's going to be part of that 1770s tax that's going to get colonists so mad that they have tax uprisings along the eastern seaboard and eventually the Boston Tea Party. And so that tax comes later. Let me see. What do we need to know about the Boston Port Acts? I'm assuming that you're asking about the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. And so with the Harbor of Boston, they get shut down. And they're going to be shut down until they repay their debt from the destroyed tea of the Boston Tea Party, in spite of the fact that they can't get money without having their harbor open. And so for the colonists, they feel like they're being treated pretty badly by the king. They're going to lose their right to have an assembly. They're going to have to lose the right to be able to meet freely. And for many people in the colonies, this is an example that the king's behavior is getting rid of salutary neglect, starting with Boston and perhaps spreading to all the rest of the colonies that might be troublemakers. So the Boston Port Acts, if I'm reading you correctly, are a crucial turning point that is going to convince a lot of Americans that there is no going back to being united with the king, unless they're willing to change their behavior. Next question I see, who is John Hancock in his role? He was working in the government during this time period. He was one of the major colonial leaders who is working on the side of independence, and obviously he was the president of the Convention for the Declaration of Independence, and that's why his signature was so large. General Cornwallis and Nathaniel Greene. Cornwallis is the guy who leads the British operation in the South. And Nathaniel Greene is one of the major generals during the American Revolution, although you won't find any major questions showing up on your test specifically about him. He's one of those people who is going to be a revolutionary hero, but as far as consequential for a survey course like ours, we just mention him to know where he was, and especially operating in the north, trying to invade Canada, and fighting in the northern part of the British against the British campaign in the north is all you need to know. Who is John Jay in the Treaty of Paris? He's one of our founding fathers who is known less than most of our other founding fathers. He will be negotiating the Treaty of Paris. He will eventually also become our first Supreme Court Chief Justice. He will also negotiate a major treaty during Washington's presidency, all of which means that for historians, they know who he is, but for a lot of common people, they don't really know who John Jay is all that much. Let me see here. What's the difference between the preliminary Treaty of Peace in 1782 and the Treaty of Paris in 1783? 1782 is your ceasefire, where the war is going to come to an end and they're going to stop shooting. But then they have to work some stuff out as far as what does America get with land, what's their negotiated rights going to be with fishing and navigation and so on. And that's going to be resolved with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. I see another question about the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and so we covered that about 5 minutes ago, and you'll be able to find that in the video there. Can I explain how and why the French first got involved in aiding the troops in America? Following the Battle of Saratoga, Ben Franklin's going to convince the French essentially the idea that the enemy of their enemy is their friend, and so they realized that we were serious about the revolution here in America, and if they joined together with the United States, they could both harass the British, who were very strong during this time. And so the French started sneaking, they started sending troops and naval ships and supplies over to America, starting to arrive in like 1780, and it really helped to pick up the American war effort when it was really starting to slip quite a bit. Let me see here. Can I explain more about Lexington and Concord and significance? Absolutely. So Lexington and Concord, if Boston is in New England, on the coast with Boston Harbor going out to the Atlantic Ocean, you have Lexington and Concord just a little bit west from there. And Lexington and Concord were like many cities that had taken the advice of the First Continental Congress that they should start stockpiling weapons and ammunition. And so they had a cache of that, and it was hidden. And the British got wind of that, and so they decided to move through the back country and try to root that out. So if you've ever heard of like the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, that's the moment that is mythologized by that famous story where the British went off into the back country looking for these weapons, and instead they found the militia training in Lexington on the village green. When they approached them, somebody fired first, and they started firing each other. The British also couldn't find where the weapons and the ammunition were, which very much scared them because it meant that the colonists might be armed in the back country. And as the British started working their way back to Boston, they were ambushed in Concord. And so this is essentially your accidental start to the American Revolution, where this wasn't really planned, but because it's happened, we now have open warfare. And nobody's really ready for that. The British weren't anticipating war, and they have issues in Europe and over in Ireland to deal with. For the Americans, they were stockpiling some, but they don't have the means and factories to be able to build all the ammunition and weapons that they need and supplies. And so both sides are going to be caught unawares by this, and it's going to be a hard start for the war for both sides. Let me see what period 5 has for questions, and like I said, I'll rotate back through. Can I explain the Model Treaty? The Model Treaty was the advice that was given to Ben Franklin by a committee here in America that we should not form military alliances, that we shouldn't engage in foreign policy alliances, that we should only try to establish trade. And that advice is going to be ignored quite a bit by Ben Franklin, who is going to create a treaty that's going to engage in commercial and military alliances with the French, with the idea that without them, we've got really no chance of winning the revolution. And it's that ignoring of that advice that allows us to get their aid following Saratoga, which will help us with the revolution. We're just going to see that for the next 4 to 5 chapters, the French and the British are now going to treat us as a second-class country, and they'll both pick on our country because of the fact that we aren't really tight with either one because of the treatment of both of them during the war. Who is Rochambeau? Rochambeau was a military leader that came from France along with the supplies to help aid in the war effort. So when we take a look at the American Revolution, one of the misconceptions that kids will have, first misconception is they'll get the idea that all the Americans are doing is guerrilla warfare and sniping. And while there is some of that going on, and in particular the Americans are doing something that's seen as unsporting, where they're shooting officers when the officers were seen as off limits in civilized warfare. In reality, their guns weren't good enough, and their communications weren't good enough to be in guerrilla warfare skirmishing against the British Army regularly. And so you're going to have the Americans and the British square off in traditional battles, marching in lines, lining up against each other. And Rochambeau is going to be coming to help fight in the same sort of war effort with French troops who are classically trained to do that same sort of fighting. Let me take a look at period 6, and then I'll cycle through all the other classes to see if I can help out. What first question for period 6 is what was the Enlightenment? And so with the Enlightenment, just keep in mind that the Enlightenment is coming during the period called the Renaissance and afterwards, when the power of the Catholic Church has been weakened because of Reformation, and as a result, that opens up a door to more scientific discussions of the causes of the way the universe works, rather than just relying on strictly religious viewpoints. Give me just 1 second. Hey, Jack. Yeah. That's hard to talk over, but I don't care. Where is it?
Oh, never mind.
All right. So with the Enlightenment, what's going to be happening is you've got a number of thinkers in Europe who are contemplating the way the universe works, and the way that they picture the universe is not like a religious construct, but they don't they don't dismiss religion. Instead, many of them are seeing the universe as being artfully created by a scientific creator. And in particular, one of the things that many of the people during the Enlightenment couldn't figure out, they could figure out everything as far as how mechanically the universe works. They just couldn't figure out how everything got set in motion at first. So there are some Enlightenment figures who will blend together science and religion with the idea that God was like the prime mover or got everything going in the universe. But many of the Enlightenment figures are believing that the universe operated on knowable mathematical formulas. And if you thought deeply enough and you observed well enough, you could then learn different ways of doing things that could be better because they were a more perfect understanding of how the universe was working. So this is going to influence a lot of thinkers in science and mathematics and health and all these other areas. Where we're focused, though, is on the political scientists and the philosophers. And so that's where we got into the discussion of like Montesquieu and Rousseau, but especially John Locke in England, who in the 1600s was writing about how all men have certain rights, that the government should be the only role that the government has, is protecting those rights, and that you should have the right to life, liberty, and property. So the follow-up question coming from Brooke, why is it important that Thomas Paine was a product of the Enlightenment? Both Paine and Jefferson's writings are showing you that they've read the Enlightenment thinkers, especially Locke, and both of them are talking about how people have certain rights that should not be taken away. They should be protected by the government, and that if the English government wasn't willing to do so, perhaps we should create a government that then provides protection for those rights. And when we articulate that in the Declaration of Independence, it really inspires a lot of Enlightenment thinkers back in Europe who had always seen John Locke as a theoretical philosopher writing about what could happen, but it was almost like science fiction. It was announcing to the world we were going to try it, and that's a really interesting thing for Enlightenment figures who might not even be excited about America becoming independent, or they might want them to remain loyal to England. But when they hear they're going to try out this experiment, it becomes pretty exciting for a lot of people who anticipate it's probably going to fail, but they're excited to watch what's going to happen. Ian's question is, can I explain the difference between happy and hippo? There isn't a difference other than the fact that when you take a look at HAPPY, and for everybody, that's your document analysis strategy you use with your DBQs that we'll be getting back to on Tuesday, so don't worry about a thing about that right now. But the H, the P are the same. Historical context is a category we can use to analyze a document, to provide context, or to set the document historically to understand why it's important. Your P's, point of view and purpose, are the same as well between happy and hippo. When it comes to the A of happy, that means audience, and the I in hippo is your intended audience. And so some teachers will teach hippo because they don't just want you to write down the name of the audience that's listed in the document. They want you to think deeper about the broader audience in society that they're trying to reach with their message. And then the Y in hippo and happy, the Y in happy is why is it important? The O in hippo is outcome. And I think the Y in important is easier to understand about when you give your historical context or your audience, you need to tie it together to your essay to explain why is this actually helping a reader to understand your topic better by getting this information from you. So you need to tie all the pieces together. So hopefully that helps, but again, we're going to be discussing that more on Tuesday, so if you got questions, we can definitely resolve that. How much of the Declaration of Independence do we need to know? I laid out the big groundwork for you as far as understanding your preamble, your Statement of Basic Human Rights, and we highlighted the key elements of the Statement of Basic Human Rights. The fact that Jefferson's arguing that all men are created equal, that they have inalienable or untakeawayable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which is even more than life, liberty, and property that Locke talked about. He argued that if a government starts abusing your rights, that it's your duty to alter or abolish it. Recognizing that there's a list of charges against the king that are taken from the Committees of Correspondence, and then the separation from the British Empire are the big takeaways that I wanted you to have from the Declaration. And so if you've got those understood, you'll be able to understand the format of the document. But then also, what I was laying out for you is this is your turning point in the American Revolution, where we're no longer fighting for salutary neglect. America is instead fighting for its own independence to create a new government styled by like the one that John Locke was dreaming of. And that's a very radical thing compared to what the Americans had been fighting for previously. Let me see the next question. In reference to the Declaratory Act, the book says that the British are reserving the Parliament's right to bind the colonies, and so when it's saying that, essentially what it's saying is that whenever Parliament passes a law, the Declaratory Act is saying that this is a legally binding agreement, that when a law is passed from Parliament, the colonists have been virtually represented, which means they took their ideas to heart. And then if a law is still created after considering their rights, the colonists must obey it or else face consequences. And so that's the point that they're trying to make with the Declaratory Act by making that statement. The second question is asking about what armed neutrality was. The French, the Spanish, Holland are going to all come to war against the British, joining the Americans to create what's essentially a global war. Making the British situation worse, then, is that having war with France and Spain and Holland is going to make it really hard to trade. The British would like to trade with other allies then, or at least some open countries. Russia, though, announces that they're going to have an armed neutrality, which means that they're not going to be super friendly to the British, and all the people who are allied with the Russians are also not going to be all that interested in working with British, and they're going to have naval ships on heightened alert. So for the British, they realize they're surrounded either by enemies or else people who are very happy to see them fail by doing nothing to actually give them extra aid or trading routes or anything like that. And this is not what the British wanted. The British wanted to focus strictly on the American colonies, suppress them quickly. And this is very much similar to like our recent wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam in the 60s, where America got the idea that because we were so large and so powerful and their enemy was so small, we should be able to win a war, wrap up the conflict, and then get out quickly without having to be bogged down in the conflict. But once you get bogged down, other countries can then get a little bit more ambitious because they'll realize that, like in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, it's going to be really hard for America to fight another war if we're bogged down in those places. And that's what England's going to find is after multiple years bogged down in America, they're now tied down to a war where if they leave, they look weak to the rest of their colonies. If they stay and they end up in a mess, they're now vulnerable to be attacked by the French and the Spanish and Holland. And so that's going to be the big issue they're running into. So that's armed neutrality in a nutshell. What is important to know about common sense? I think I highlighted previously the idea that it's embracing Enlightenment philosophies and it's laying out a broader visions rather than just fighting for salutary neglect. It's highlighting for the colonists why they should be mad, why they should unite, and it gives a vision of a popular government that might be different than the one that they've got currently. Let me see here. What acts? Let me see here. Can I explain more about Lafayette? Lafayette was a young man who came over to America from France and joined with Washington, and the two of them fought side by side. And Lafayette was also somebody who was able to send messages back to France seeking aid that could help out with the war effort. Taking a look at period 4. Let me see here. What was the reasoning of the British evacuation of Boston in 1776? Was Boston or Philadelphia a rebel headquarters? that's the tricky element. And so for first of all, when you talk about rebel headquarters, at different times the colonists are going to have leaders in Boston, like the Sons of Liberty. Philadelphia, with the Declaration of Independence, they will have some people in New York because it's a major trading area. But then also you've got many leaders who are just in the back country, and especially with George Washington, the military moving around the back country, the British thought that if they conquered the rebel headquarters, they would then win the war. And what they realized was there wasn't really a rebel headquarters that was permanent. If you're a fan of Star Wars and you know how the rebels kept moving from place to place, making the Empire chase them, the parallel is similar. And so for the colonists, they're going to have all of those cities conquered at different times. The reasoning for the British evacuation of Boston, though, is they were going to lose. And so they felt super confident about being in Boston. The problem is Boston is in an area that is surrounded by bluffs, and they've got hills all around them. And so the Americans were able to surround Boston. They then were able to take cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and put them on sleds and pull them down to Boston. And then they were able to ring the harbor with cannons. So they were all aimed at Boston. They started bombarding the city itself. And the people inside, the colonists, they weren't really worried about blowing up Boston. I mean, it was a small town anyways. And so if stuff got blown up or whatever, they could rebuild. But they were going to pound the British. And the British realized that they were in such a bad situation that they couldn't even take their cannons with them. They did something called spiking their cannons, where they actually drove spikes into the opening in the cannon to make them unusable, and then they dumped them in Boston Harbor so the colonists couldn't use them immediately against the British. And then the British evacuated. And their feeling was Boston wasn't worth the hassle. So after Boston, that's when the British decided to focus on New York in a central location that could be used to cut off the New England colonies if Burgoyne can move south through the Hudson River Valley, which obviously didn't work out with Saratoga. So let me scan through the rest of the class and see if any other questions have popped up. Period 5. Nope. Period 6. Nope. Period 2. Nope. And period 4. Looks like we're good there. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give a shout out to my boy who had to give up playing Battlefront. And he's now playing Amazing Spider-Man, which allows him to be in like a real world environment in Manhattan, moving around as Spider-Man. But because of the fact that it was using so much bandwidth, it was a choice between either Spider-Man or showing a review video to you guys. And so my boy was willing to sacrifice Spider-Man for a little bit, but he'll now be able to jump back on real quick before we go up to basketball.
He's awesome.
And he loves Lafayette, by the way, and so hopefully you share his love. Secondarily, I'll be checking emails for the remainder of tonight while I'm doing some grading, so feel free to send any messages you have. I hope tomorrow's test is an improvement for all of you, and so I'm hoping you're finding good study strategies that are working out. If not, I'm excited to work with you this upcoming week, and so if you have any problems or concerns, I would love to work with you as we move forward. So remember, tomorrow, Chapter 7 and 8 test. Tuesday is going to be our second 50 states test, and hopefully after that, your grades are looking good. Thanks for the hard work, you guys. Good luck tonight, and I will see you tomorrow.